So welcome everybody to our second session in our History at Newcastle seminar series for the first semester of 2026. As usual, I would like to begin by paying respects to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people and recognize that we're meeting on their unceded land and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. It is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Professor Katie Barclay from Macquarie University. Professor Barclay is currently a future fellow in the Department of History and Archaeology at Macquarie, and is an expert, a leading expert on the history of emotions, gender, and family life. Prior to Macquarie, she was based at the University of Adelaide and has a significant CV that I won't mention here in detail, but you can certainly look her up at and be very impressed by that. We're very happy to have her here today, and she'll be talking to us about defaming men, masculinity, and hurt feelings in 19th and 20th century Scotland. So without any further ado, I'll welcome Katie to the stand here and share the screen, and we'll go from there. Just one moment. All the usual Zoom silliness that we got to deal with. And put that down there. All right. There, wonderful.
So, can everybody hear me in the various locations? Cool. All right, so yes, so thank you for having me. It's nice to come up. It was a lovely train journey, and this is a beautiful campus. So very nice to be here and to see you all. I'm just going to have a mouthful of water. So today I'm talking about a new project, and if I eventually write this into a paper, which hopefully I will, this will probably be the first paper I've got coming out of this project. And I called it Defaming Men, because if you have a Scottish accent, that sounds a bit like Raining Men. And that's and for me alone, that's quite entertaining. But I'm going to start with a story. So hang on, how do I make it move forward? There we go. So this is a case from 1969 where G.H. Steele, the motor dealer, sues the Daily Record, which is one of Scotland's major papers, even today, for defamation. And then the report in the news, what the Daily Record reported, was that Steele had a customer that he'd taken a £10 deposit from, which in the 1960s is a substantive chunk of money, for a van that this customer wanted to buy, and the customer was to come back and pay the rest of the money and get the van. But in the meantime, the customer had got the cash, he had it in his house, and he'd been robbed. So somebody came in, stolen all his money, and he wasn't able to buy the van. So he goes back to Steele and says to Steele, look, I would like to get my money back. I can't afford to buy the van anymore. You know, I'm in trouble. And Steele said, oh, look, can't do that, right? That's not how deposits work. But what we can do is we could move the deposit onto another vehicle, like a car or something that's cheaper, right? So you can still get a good deal, but, you know, like you won't be able to get the van, but I can't give you the £10 back. Okay, so the guy who got robbed is very upset about this, tells the journalist, and the journalist writes this story, and it includes this great line where when the journalist asked the victim, you know, what would you like to say to Mr. Steele? He says, have a heart. That's my message to motor dealer Mr. Steele. But what I found particularly entertaining about this is that this report goes out about this cruel, you know, motor dealer and very kind of big businessman, and Steele takes it very personally. He finds it offensive. He thinks it's defamatory, and so he sues. And this is from his claim. So the pursuer in Scots law, that is the person who is pursuing the suit. He was a ruthless and unsympathetic businessman who used his vastly superior position unfairly or in any event without due regard for the feelings and misfortunes of his customers. So that's how he felt he was represented, and he thought that was defamatory. He thought that was wrong. That was not the man that he was. And because the newspaper suggested this, he was deeply hurt in his feelings by the allegations that he acted unfairly and without sympathy or compassion. And also that by publicising his lack of sympathy and compassion, that he was brought into public injury and contempt, that the public hated him as a result. He was a bad guy. So his basis of defamation was actually around this representation of him as somebody who didn't have compassion, which is a really interesting sort of set of claims for defamation. We often think about defamation as you're a thief or you are immoral, maybe in the 19th century, but less so in a sort of an emotional disposition of the self, right? And this is the set of claims he's making, is that this emotional disposition is something worth defending and that he doesn't feel this fairly represented who he was. So eventually the court thinks about it. It's a reasonably nice case with some nice evidence, but the judge eventually comes to the conclusion that actually there is no defamation here, okay? And his argument is, this is the last statement, this is the judge, there is nothing unusual or exceptional in a businessman being unsympathetic. Indeed, he would hardly be a successful businessman if he was sympathetic, and I do not see how such a representation is calculated to hold the pursuer up to public hatred or contempt. And so the conclusion that the judge comes to is actually, no, businessmen are hard-nosed, right? That's fine. This is a perfectly legitimate thing to say about you, and so therefore doesn't really bring you into any sort of disrepute or defamation. But I love this story because I love the fact that there's a guy who's it's so important to him to appear compassionate and sympathetic that he's willing to sue over it. And I'm also interested in the court who has to sit there and go, no, but business people aren't, right? This is, why would we think that? And so the way that these emotions then come into court and become a space for men to think about what their emotional selves are, what kind of self they want to be seen as, and the way that different men in this court are then having to adjudicate that. In the 1969, it could have been a woman judge, but it really wasn't. So really, that was still quite rare at this point. So in this talk, I want to explore how men constructed a sense of self in the Scottish defamation cases over a sort of long 20th century. I'll tell you a bit about the project this comes out of next, but I do start in 1750. But really, this paper is kind of starting in the sort of 1880s and kind of goes up to the end of the 20th century. I want to talk today about legal emotions, the way the law constructs the emotional self in particular ways, and the way that these are also masculine selves. So there is also women who sue for defamation, but they have, I think, a set of different concerns. So today we're thinking about men and the masculine self. And so a lot of this talk is examples of how men are constructing a particular kind of emotional self in the court or in these papers that are sent to the court. And I want to think about that in the context of modernising Scottish society and how we might think about men and what they are meant to be in this period. So this comes out of a larger funded project by Leverhulme. So it's held at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm doing this work with Chloe Kennedy, Alice Krasnick and Jacob Fredrickson on a history of hurt feelings and the law. And so we're kind of interested in when you go to court because your feelings got hurt. And so we're not that interested in a particular type of suit. I'm talking about defamation today because that's just what I've been working on. But we're also looking at negligence and breach of contract and a whole lot of other kinds of suits, even some criminal liabilities, where the fact that you've hurt someone's feelings actually comes up as an issue that the court has to provide redress for. And we're kind of interested in the ways that over time, the emotions that can be offered redress for change, and how that's shaped by ideas about emotion. So over the period 1750 to the present day, psychology literally gets invented in that period, right? So you're kind of saying, well, what happens when we have these new ideas about the body and the self and the mind, and how are they shaping how emotions get thought about in court and then compensated for in a legal sense? And so this is the larger project that we're doing. But today I'm talking about defamation because I've been working my way through defamation suits. This paper also contributes to a discussion of Scottish masculinity and emotion. There's actually very little written about Scottish masculinity in pretty much any period, and about 80% of what has been written by me. So, so we're kind of in that place. And what I've done a lot on is around Scottish men and their representations of themselves as loving in the sense of a Christian neighbourly love. They see themselves as good Christians, so they are compassionate and sympathetic. They see themselves as peaceful and honourable through its kind of Christian communal neighbourly sense of self. And so my book Caritas talks a lot about how this sense of neighbourly love is very important to Scots' sense of who they are and how they relate to the other. We also, though, do have a small literature on 20th century masculinity, which in some ways is quite different. A lot of it is on working class men, and particularly men who work in industries like coal and steel and shipbuilding. So these very hard, kind of hard working industries. And that work has talked a lot about this representation of Scottish men as hard men. They want to be seen as strong. Their physical strength is actually quite important to that presentation of the self. So when men are disabled, as they often are, industrial accidents, it's not just an injury that's a problem by itself, but that it kind of undermines that whole sense of who they are and how they think about their place in the world. And so we have this sort of hard men reputation that also goes, I think, through to certain kinds of expectations for violent behaviour and certain kinds of honour. And that's how we've kind of thought like 20th century Scotland. And we've also thought a little bit, about quiet men. So there's a really great quote from a trade unionist in the 1920s in his autobiography, where he says that Scottish men are particularly reticent to talk about their emotions and to say that they love their wives, and they don't do that. And actually, in the book that I wrote on marriage for that period, that is what I found, that they did love their wives, but they did it as a practice. And so there was not a lot of talking about feelings. And so that was kind of interesting because there's a kind of quiet love. And so for me, there's always been an interesting gap that I need to fill at some point between my loving Scottish early modern guys, right, and my modern guys who are quiet and quite restrained, and thinking about how that modernisation process has happened, what has it done to shape how men articulate the sense of self, I guess, in different ways over time. And I think that's why I found the Steele case quite interesting, because to me, we've got this idea that by the time we get to the 20th century, this loving community has gone in Scotland, and we've got these kind of more restrained, hard men, and that's a change. But we've now got people still claiming for compassion in these cases, that's a part of the self. And so I'm wondering, or I'm asking, are we actually seeing some longer continuities of values that are being held through into the 20th century, and what's kind of happening in that picture? Can I fill that gap, I guess, between our early modern sense of the loving self and this modern self? And these are the kinds of things I'm trying to think through, I guess, in relation to masculinity. And so in this paper, I'm thinking about this in relation to defamation cases, but also I want to think about masculinity as an emotional self and as an embodied self. So how are people presenting themselves as feeling? And also towards the end, I'm going to talk about examples of how men relate this, how they actually present themselves in a sort of physical and embodied way. These are also legal emotions. This is a bit of the theory. So when people write a defamation suit, or a lawyer writes it for you, it isn't just a sort of natural, free-flowing kind of self. You've got to kind of construct it in ways that matters for the law. And so defamation is a case in point. Not everything is defamatory. We'll talk about this in a minute. Certain kinds of arguments are not defamatory. And so then you have to say, well, what is? And so in Steele's case, he clearly does it wrong. He puts together this case that he's compassionate, and the judge says no. But nonetheless, the lawyer certainly thought that he had a chance to do that. And that is because the space, I think, in Scottish defamation law to present a particular kind of emotional self is actually a very much part of character, part of how the law gives you space to represent a particular kind of man. And so I think when we are thinking about what emotions we're seeing here, we do need to think about them as emotions that are constructed for the law and to get certain kinds of outcomes for the law. But I don't think that means that they are not real, or that they're just fictions. I think that people do this because they have hurt feelings, because they want compensation, and this is just actually about how the law directs it. And I also think it's kind of an interesting sense of what you call about norms, and about how society thinks about itself in terms of being orderly and disorderly. And so legal norms are saying, well, there's a kind of perfect way that we should be, a perfect kinds of behaviour, and that we want to uphold and support through allowing for defamation claims. And there are kinds of behaviours that we want to discourage by allowing people to win defamation suits. And so there's kind of what we can see, even if it's not a perfect representation of an individual self, it's a sense of what the Scottish society values in men and values as a form of masculinity. And so the legal emotions are sort of representations of these ideal forms of masculinity. And so I'm thinking about this as the performance of emotion. where performance doesn't mean fake or theatrical. It just means how do we present ourselves as emotional subjects? How do we think about how that is done for an audience? How can that then be read and judged and evaluated? And so the question here is, how do the defamation cases really allow us to access those performance of legal emotions? Okay. Before we get on to talking about men and their emotions, I also want to think a bit about the loving community, because in a way, when you think about how the law works, you have to kind of go, well, it has to have an imagination of what the society should look like and what it should be, right? And that is when you come to make a defamation claim, it's not actually just about you and yourself. It's about saying the world should work in this way. It has been disordered and disrupted, and I need you to make that right in various ways to make the society orderly again. And I think this is where we do still see some of these kind of ideals of the loving community that are very apparent in the early modern world, still kind of underpinning law in this period. So one big part of, I should say this actually, in Scotland, defamation, libel, slander, and verbal injury, which is a very important kind of Scots law, are all words that are we can use all of them. There is no, they're not separated out like they are in the common law, right? And so in a way that the law is a much more amorphous kind of beast in that way, and it allows for a much greater flexibility of actually what you can claim as a kind of harm, because we're not actually separating these out into particular rigid categories. We're kind of going, there's a bunch of harms here that are about insulting people in various formats, written, spoken, in public, and private. And they all kind of come under the same legal umbrella. And the judge has to kind of sort through that. And so that the legal record themselves use these words very interchangeably. So I do too, so I wouldn't worry about the technical language there. But there are different kinds of harms that you see coming up again and again in these kind of defamation cases. One is that you brought someone into public hatred, ridicule, or humiliation. Now, that's especially evident if it's in the newspaper, for example. And by the end of the 20th century, the majority of defamation cases revolve around newspaper reporting. And so public hatred is the way that you move somebody. Oh, all right. So I think public hatred is really interesting because it kind of suggests this person was part of the community, they were kind of operating within it, and then because of this action taken by another, they were then excluded from it, they were hated, they were kind of moved out. And words like humiliation and ridicule also have that sense of shunning, of separation, of moving a person out of the community. And so what happens in the defamation case is it brings somebody back into the fold if they win. The idea is it kind of enfolds them back and says, no, they have a rightful place in this community. There's also reputational harm, which if you know anything about defamation is fairly kind of standard harms, that you had a professional reputation that has been damaged, you were a motor dealer, nobody's buying your cars anymore. There are or other kinds of harm that might have real financial impacts or reputational impacts that affect your capacity to act or to participate in the public. The thing that's really interesting in Scots law is you can sue for hurt feelings. You cannot do this in the common law, right? This is very distinctively Scottish. This common law basically says people have feelings. If we allowed you to sue for it, we just spend a whole day in courts. Everybody was suing for everything. And the Scots go, yes, bring it on, right? So we can sue for hurt feelings, which means we get a lot more feelings in the record as people articulate what that means. But also it's a really interesting kind of case because in the English counterpart, you only really see claims around feelings when they are very extreme or they're psychiatric illness, but where they're so big and out there that somehow they then become very legally relevant. And actually what you're getting in the Scottish case are people going, well, I have very ordinary human feelings, but it's still not fair that I felt them. And so it's kind of like this really interesting discussion about under what conditions is your very normal, boring human emotions actually legally an issue and somebody shouldn't have actually caused you to have them. And this actually is not just in defamation, but across a whole lot of what we call delict or tort under English law. You've got this kind of case where hurt feeling is available as a claim, and we're all kind of going, well, is this enough shot? Are you have hated enough? What kind of, So it's really interesting for if you care about emotions. And the other thing that's kind of worth mentioning here is what is called privilege, which under certain kinds of conditions you are actually allowed to defame someone. And that is, for example, if you're a judge in a court or a police officer who arrests someone, or you are writing a reference for a job, for example. There are conditions where you can make a case and say, I had a responsibility because of my job to say or do a certain set of defamatory things, which we accept are defamatory, but actually I had to do that because it was my job to do that, right? And so you have privilege kind of comes in to allow for certain kinds of harms to exist in this community, as long as they are very well bounded and have certain kinds of conditions around them. The kind of point I wanted to make here is that the law is kind of imagining a community of people being pushed outside it and brought back in for these legal actions, and that where emotion is really a part of how you understand your relation to the community. If you feel hurt or harmed, then you feel outside of it, and we embrace you and show you love to bring you back in. So this is, I think, the very early modern way that our tradition continues in this law. And there's a big emphasis in this imaginary world, I guess, on peace and on privacy, so that defamation often exposes things that should be private, I think, in some ways, about the self. Okay, so what kind of men are we finding in these papers? So honourable men is perhaps the most expected finding. So you want to be honest, and you want to have a reputation as an honourable person who doesn't commit crimes or behave criminally, or who maybe commits adultery. There's kinds of sets of actions that you think are quite expected. The thing that I think is very interesting is how many of these acts also revolve around the concept of privacy. And so that, yes, there are certain kinds of wrongs that can happen, but you cannot do this you cannot expose a person even if they have committed a wrong, because it becomes defamatory. And so I've got two cases here, both from 1916. There's actually a lot of these cases, and they're all great, where various people are on the train and the guard suggests that their ticket isn't the right ticket, or they don't have a ticket. And so they are basically defrauding the railway by not having the right ticket for the journey, right? And what actually always happens in these cases is the guardsman does not do this discreetly enough. And so I don't know what the imagination is here. They might take them into a little office and hide them away and accuse them, but they do it in public in front of other people in the station. In the second case, in the presence of the pursuer's wife and daughter, terrible. But they are being challenged, I guess, around their honesty in a public space, in a public framing. And so they've got this kind of sense of they're honourable men, but also they're men whose, if they were being dishonourable, is being exposed in this way. And that is actually the liability is actually around the breach of privacy and the exposure of the dishonesty, which is as much at stake here as, in fact, the dishonesty itself. And of course, in both these cases, they both say, no, I had a ticket. So, they're also going for the fact they are honest men. But it's really interesting how the privacy part is also a really strong part of the story. The other kind of thing, category that comes under honourable men are, I would say, competencies. And this actually becomes, I would say, the majority of defamation cases in a way, are around professional selves, where you have certain qualities and conditions of yourself. Like, I'm an academic. As an academic, I imagine myself to be good at talking and writing papers and teaching students, right? And then you come along and say, Katie is a terrible teacher. All the students cry at the end of her class. It's just really dreadful. And I'm like, I'm insulted by that. It is a kind of offence to my kind of sense of a professional self and the various capacities that are imagined in that professional self. And there's lots and lots of those cases. And so a couple of kind of modern ones is a police officer. So he was an arsehole. The police officer breaks into someone's house to arrest someone, gets in a fight with all the other family members in the house, right? It's the whole scrummy. Yeah, I do think he was a hooligan, actually. I think the way he behaved in that situation was not great. But then the person puts a formal complaint, a written complaint into the police about him, and the police officer then sues for defamation, saying that the written complaint actually undermined his professional reputation, his reputation from his bosses, and all of those things. And so, like, they called him a hooligan, and the police officer caused fear and alarm. And as a result of this, the police officer had hurt feelings and also a lowered self-esteem. So, in the 1953 case, Shanks sues the BBC. Shanks is an accountant with an accountancy firm, and the BBC basically accuses him of fraud. And so he then says that, the BBC it's the British Broadcasting, that by accusing him of conduct in business that is fraudulent or inept, they had a serious injury to his feeling, standing and professional reputation. But in both of these cases, it's not just a kind of saying, oh, they're dishonest. It's actually a case here about, it's actually about their capacity to do their jobs well, that you expect as an accountant, that he would be able to make sure the money went in the places it was meant to go and they'd be able to see that. And if he's not done that, which is the claim, it's either because he's behaving illegally or because he's so bad at his job, he doesn't know what was happening. So there's kind of a sense that you have these competencies that sort of shape who you are, and to undermine them is to hurt your feelings and to hurt your self-esteem. We also have a recurring issue of people being good fathers or grandparents. And so in the 20s, we get actually several people sue the RSPCC, which is the Society for Protective Children, for being accused of neglect. In the first case here, the wife had ran away and took the child, and he was refusing to pay alimony until she came back. And the RSPCC then tried to sue for, they wanted them to pay alimony. But because he was accused of neglect, he felt that was an insult and caused him unnecessary suffering or injury. And the judge says in this, I'm supposed to feel some sympathy with the pursuer's case, for on his own showing at least he has been hardly used. And so the court recognised, I think, that he wasn't literally neglecting the child. He was in a dispute about alimony, which is a kind of slightly different issue, but also because the RSPC just refused to stop using the word neglect, which I think was also their own fault in some ways. But all the way through to the these kinds of cases continue. 2012, H. It's interesting in this case, even in the legal record, this is anonymised, right? So this is not me. We don't know who H is, but H was a Romani man, so it's a travelling community in Scotland, who, in a report over the neglect of his grandchild, it was indicated that he had they'd been talked to by social work about his behaviour, and he very much objected to the implication that he was somehow accused of being involved in his child's neglect. And this becomes a proper rammy where he goes around and fly it. So the court agent, who is a solicitor, who takes all the evidence, wrote this report. And he hated this report so much that he started putting letters through people's doors, insulting him and saying that the solicitor was bad at his job and a liar and a whole lot of stuff, right? So this was a properly good fight in 2012. But interesting, in both cases here, both parties on this. So in this case, the Romani gentleman, he was under a great deal of anxiety and worry, and necessitated a referral to the local psychiatric team. And the other side, the solicitor, also was mentally unwell, but also his wife was, and she was particularly upset. That man projected a lot of his own mental health illnesses onto his wife, is my opinion on what happens in that case. But the point here is that, one, we're getting much more medicalised language, but across the whole of the century, accusations of child neglect, child abuse, anything in that space, people walk away from. They want to be good parents, good fathers. Men are passionate in this record, and this is a very modern emotion. So if you were an early modern Scot, you're expected to exercise, I would say, very high levels of self-control. You're meant to be peaceful, peaceable. In 1798, in the defamation case, somebody suggests that the defamation occurred within a fight, and it was actually just an insult, and it wasn't a defamatory claim. It was just a quarrel. It was short-tempered, and the court actually were quite interested in that at that point, but decided that it wasn't really a good enough excuse. This argument comes up again until in 1899 we get a case, Christie v. Robertson, where during a fight he called somebody a bloody liar, and the court decides it was mere vulgar abuse intended by way of retaliation, and the parties were hot-tempered. And as a result of that, it was not defamation, right? It was a fight, and it was a quarrel, and they took this whole area of insulting people during fights and just put it outside of the defamation law, okay? And what then happens for the next sort of 40 years is people continue to bring these quarrels to court. And so in Fleming and Craig, it was fight or property damage, damned liar, again. This one is good because they refuse to withdraw the words, right? So after the fight is over, the person who's insulted says, just take it back. And he's like, I'm not taking it back. Take it back. Take it back. And that's why it ends up in court. And so, again, a man who had admittedly lost his temper, really a denial expressed, it may be in strong terms. And then in 51, this is brought up again, actually in a different kind of case, but they're saying, well, vituperation is generally uttered in the heat of a quarrel, and it's not so easy to regard statements as merely abusive if they have been repeated after passion was cooled. And so we've got this sense, and we've created this moment, this kind of fight, that men are passionate, they're short-tempered. In that moment, they might say stupid stuff, but really we don't want to actually allow that to kind of move into defamation law anymore. It's a really modern decision. I like to call it the boys will be boys defence, right? But more importantly, I think here is the sense of which that men are going to be short-tempered and they're going to fight, and actually that's just part of what makes them men, right? And so that we then have to include a kind of defence around that in the law. And also there's a kind of, I put public figure expectations here as well, because the other group of people who are expected to put up with abuse are public figures, where by being in public office, you're meant to have a much higher tolerance for people insulting in the press, for public speaking about your actions. The bar is higher for you to prove defamation. So it's kind of an interesting kind of creation, I think, in this modern period of a particularly kind of passionate, short-tempered self for masculinity, and also an expectation that you put up with it, that a hard man is one that can put up with this stuff. Compassionate and sensitive to others. Now we're back to the thing that really kind of made me excited. So all across the period, we have claims of men trying to represent themselves in ways where they think of themselves as sensitive or compassionate or just kind of nice, but as kind of emotionally intuitive people. So in Campbell v. Barclay, so this is a master-servant case, but the servant, who was a teenager, he was accused of ill-treating, abusing or torturing a horse. And he was so upset by this that he said it caused injury to feelings, character and reputation. And so we kind of got several animal abuse claims where people are very offended at the idea that you could say that they hurt an animal. Then we have got like Leach for Lyle. This is a school teacher who, during a kind of meeting in the council, somebody said he's a man that cannot be trusted nor should be trusted with the care of the school. The atmosphere of the school was demoralising. And so he thought that that was an insult to his role as a teacher in the school. But I also think it was kind of interesting here. It was about he wasn't caring, he could not care for his school, but also the fact that the issue here was that there was sort of the sense that there was a moral, emotional state that the school could be in, that he was somehow disrupting or ruining with himself. And he found that quite insulting. In 22, we've got Cochrane and Young. This is a manager in a firm who's utterly obnoxious and offensive and makes use of obscene and indescribably filthy language when addressing us, which he swears a lot, but they're not. For ours, I would say the swearing wasn't that bad, but the swearing clearly offended a lot of the women that he worked with. Immoral conduct, because he flirted with them all, and it caused, to him though, being accused of this, it caused great injury to feelings. So this is kind of maybe a moral representation, but it's also kind of a representation of a man who should be able to get along with women, who felt that was important that he was not seen as somebody who was in some way insulting or who caused a bad atmosphere in his organisation. He was insulted by these claims. And then we get to our car dealer and his anger over not being compassionate and sympathetic. So all across this century, we have these men who are coming in because they want to be seen as men that have a certain kind of moral or emotional self, and that self is worth defending. Okay, our final kind of, self that we see in this, which I've been thinking about what to call it. I'm calling it embodied dignity for this moment, but I'm not quite sure. And this is because I was struck by the amount of cases where, okay, first what happens in public. So you can go back to the idea about the fact certain kinds of things should happen in private, but they also involve close kind of engagement or viewing of a person's body. So in Adams v Templeton, he's a factory worker. When he's coming out of the factory one day, they think he's stealing, and they stop him at the gate. And so all the other workers are coming out of the factory at the same time, and he is stopped, and they ask to search him, and he allows them to search their pockets. But then they want him to take his jacket off and his under jacket, and they want him to take his trousers off, and he absolutely refuses to do that. And so they take him into a separate room, but there's still 3 other people in that room, and they strip search him. And he said it caused him a profound shock. He was greatly outraged. He refused to come back to work for several days. And that, this is the legal stuff, but he had utter disregard to the pursuer's feelings and reputation. And Adamson v Martin, this is great, because this isn't allowed. So you've got a minor, 16, is accused of a crime, and then after you go up to your first showing to the police, magistrate, and then you might go home and come back to the trial, right? But instead, they take him away, and they take his photograph, and they fingerprint him. Now, under Scots law at that point, you wouldn't have done that as part of an investigative process. You only do that after you have actually been found guilty of a crime, right? And so he felt, or his mother, I think, suspected, he felt that this was actually depicted him as a criminal, even though he wasn't a criminal. And when they asked, well, why did that happen? Like, why was this photograph taken? It was because it's basically put in a book of mugshots. It was then passed around so everybody could know that he was a local criminal. And so it was kind of defamatory in multiple senses because they were using it to kind of spread the word around who the criminals were. And so actually the result of that case is they didn't give him any money, but they did destroy the photograph. And so that's it. In Miller v. Kerr, you've got councilmen who they were arguing about being conscientious objectors during the war, which I love, right? But one of them, this is called nose tweaking in one case, assault in another news report of it, or pulling the nose. So this is an insult where somebody is pulling your nose as a part of a very physical insulting practice, and the men basically get in a fight. But the one then says that he had also served elsewhere, and everyone's like, what does that sentence mean? And he goes, well, it's about the tone in which it had been made, and the fact that he interrupted to say it. But basically, it was kind of this implication that conscious objectives had been cowardly, and that then with the tweaking of the nose and then the fighting, I think it is actually quite confusing. What actually happened in that moment is quite confusing. Like, it's hard to figure out. But I felt it was kind of interesting that there was a physical part of how that insult came to be, I guess, embodied, to be displayed, to be performed. And eventually in embodied dignity, I'm also interested, we start to get the rise of mental distress as opposed to just hurt feelings, with the kind of, I guess, a psychiatry becomes part of the story. And so these kind of claims to mental distress are actually also claiming a certain kind of physical component of how harm and hurt happens. But what I want to suggest about all of these kind of defamatory claims in a way is they're not just imagining you as sort of somebody who has emotions on the inside, but the ways that your body and the way it's touched and felt and looked at in public spaces comes to be a part of the self, that in certain part of your dignity that can then be disrupted or interrupted in various ways, that then become a source of defamation. Okay, so what did we see from that? I didn't find many hard men. I mean, the Rixa stuff with the fighting, I think you start to see that picture of men who are expected to tolerate a certain level of insult and violence. But generally, we see men who are quite community orientated. They're very sensitive to their reputation, to be included in the public, to being wanted to maintain that reputation. We see them as people who are emotional, who see emotions as worthy of being protected, of having kinds of emotions, and of legally protecting their right to have those emotions. There are also embodied subjects who worry about their physical bodies, their presentation, how it is used and touched and deployed as part of these processes. So I think we are seeing a continuation of some of the value of that early modern loving community and that kind of man that the early modern Scottish world valued and wanted. But we're also seeing it kind of offset by these short-tempered, passionate selves, which are bringing up a kind of new, kind of harder masculinity in this period. I think that we also, with the move to mental well-being, we see an individualisation of harm over community-facing wrongs, which is quite interesting. And I'm also interested in the fact that the court then becomes less convinced that things like the compassionate self, it becomes vital to certainly the manly business self, maybe all manly selves. So the court is also there kind of thinking about what it means to be a man. And so the loving society is there, but it's becoming less important over time, perhaps, and that the court itself is less convinced of its need in an orderly world. Thank you.
Let me just play around with the audio really quickly so we don't have a bunch of reverb when it comes to asking questions, especially on Zoom. Just give me one moment here. But we do have plenty of time for questions for the well-timed talk. I didn't realize we had that camera to work with, so we could have had a much better view of the speaker during that time. Next time we will make that work. All right, can everybody hear me on Zoom through this room now? Can I just get a thumbs up from Bronwyn or Trishti if you can hear me? So, okay, cool. All right, so yeah, we have plenty of time for questions from Sasha.
That was really interesting. I now have to rethink everything I ever thought I knew about Scottish men. I'm curious about the reception of these court cases. Have you looked? I mean, I'm not quite. Firstly, are you working from the court papers or from press reports, or what kind of sources are you working from? And secondly, if you have looked at press reports, are these claims looked upon with sympathy or scorn, or how does the press respond to them?
So I'm looking at both, I guess, is the short answer. But I haven't been into the archive. I've done the archive for the early period. I still need to do a lot of the 19th. I probably won't get access to the archive for most of the 20th century. We can, after in the last 100 years, if you want the case, you have to make a case for it to be brought to you. So that's the sort of thing that really does need to happen at the end when you've finally decided that you've got some really important cases that should breach our privacy law to allow me to look at. And we're not there yet. But so basically, what a lot of these cases are ones that actually are appealed for various reasons, and often they are for very technical legal reasons that have nothing to do with the juicy stuff that I care about, and actually to do with technical stuff. And that they end up in the law reports, and then the law reports are reasonably good summaries of the case, and particularly judges' decisions and things like that. And then we get press reports. Your average defamation case doesn't get a lot of attention, to be honest. You often it's 2 lines. That's why with the nose pulling case, I have several press reports because it involves councilmen who are reasonably high status, but no really good description of what happened in the court, so that we actually can get a good kind of sense of actions. So it's a bit of both. I think that there are cases where we see a lot of sympathy tend to be much more high profile. Like there's a woman who is prison guard. This is a very modern case, 1980s. Who's accused of having sex with one of the inmates. And it's the son. I don't think I've heard of the son. Very scandalous, and especially in the 80s, they were very salacious. And so they basically had a picture of a woman in her underwear, like in a prison guard thing, and they described the sex act that she was accused of doing in quite a lot of detail in the press. And it's all made up, right? And so she accuses him for defamation. That case gets a lot of coverage. The defamation case gets a lot of coverage, I think, because it was so salacious in the first place, but also it was felt to be particularly, like, that wasn't just insult by accident. In some ways, that was somebody actively trying to destroy a woman's character. And so the press, there's a lot of coverage around that case. So you do, sometimes there are sympathy, but I think in a lot of cases, it's just standard court reporting, but there's, kind of interesting. It's a bit interesting, but not enough to care about that much.
Kathy.
Thanks so much. It was so interesting. I'm interested in the law as an institution that partly defines the definition of respectable society, and being faced with essentially these demands from men saying, well, I belong, I'm part of this, please can you tick the box, and how they exerted their authority, how the law exerted their authority, and particularly where you have situations of people perhaps from different cultures or different classes. You sort of mentioned gender a little bit there, but I wonder how that differed.
Yeah, and I think that becomes more like in the earlier period where class matters a whole lot more, I guess. Although actually in the 1920s, there's a lot of arguments about class. Like, for example, a woman a journalist comes to her home, she's a minor, and like as a coal miner, right? And she's very poor, lives in a one-roomed house with a bed in the one room, and all the men are in the house having their meal. She comes home from work, takes off, I would imagine, her outer clothes, because nobody sleeps naked in this period, gets into bed. The journalist writes about how that she had no moral values. He wasn't accusing her as a person. It was actually about mining communities are so terrible and they only have one bedroom and it's so immiserated that even the poor girl who comes from the mine takes off her clothes in front of a bunch of men and gets into bed. And she sues him for defamation, which is completely fascinating, right? But because she's incredibly poor. But also, like, she's like, no, I didn't do anything immoral. This was actually, like, this is a room, this is how we live. There was absolutely nothing immoral about that action, and you're overreading this, and it was wrong to do that. So there is actually, I think, in the 20s, a kind of moment of, I guess, a space where people are trying to articulate that working class people have as much dignity and right to defamation in some ways as everyone else. But a lot of the rest of it is actually just middle class men are taken more seriously than working class men when they come into court, right? That's just kind of reality. And it's not really until the second half of the 20th century where that those sort of distinctions actually disappear a lot. That it's just a case that's kind of taken on its merits and you don't see it. I would say on the case that involved the Romany, the traveller, I think that case was pretty racist. The traveller himself claims that his treatment was racist. The court was racist. The court, which is a bunch of white people, said, "Oh no, we were not being racist." And also because it involved a solicitor as well, who's part of the legal profession. Everybody backs it up and goes, "No, nobody's been racist." I'm looking at this case going, "That's pretty racist to me, guys." Just got to be honest. So I kind of think there are ways that we can kind of see the way that the court inscribes and values certain kinds of people over others, but it does change at various moments, I guess. And also it's a space for that negotiation.
Hey, this is so fascinating. The question I have sort of sits a little bit alongside of the notion of the court case is more in that bigger question that you're asking around men and hardness, that disposition. So across the arc of the time that you're discussing, I'm put in mind of the Marxist notion of the metabolic rift when we consider the shift that men went through. And so I'm just going to sort of suggest what's come up for me as I'm listening to you and then ask you to comment on that, which is that in as the Scottish Economic Order, men have, if I have this correct, kind of gone fundamentally in the so in the early modern period, they are, and then go to a different state. They are fundamentally agricultural, so not highly urbanized, not industrialized yet. In that definition of modernity, and I do understand that you're going to come up with a definition of modernity. I can see that's what you're reaching for. That's really exciting. But thinking about the experience of being a man in an agricultural society is very much about a form of nurturance because there's a nurturance of animals and nature. There's a sense of rhythms and seasonality where, and I don't mean to overly romanticize this, I just mean in contrast to industrial modernity, where there can be a sense of human rhythms much more attuned to natural rhythms and also work in family units. So an experience of masculinity that's very different to once factories open, once there's more urbanization, and then there's that, it's a type of a form of metabolic rift from the earlier nurturance, seasonality, attunement to nature to this much more restrictive sense of the way that the day is formed and, shoehorning men into being then working class and factory workers. Do you see in what you're doing something that means some of that hardness comes from losing the connection to you spoke about the loving neighborliness, and that to me, I associate that with an agricultural society versus the economic experience, the class-based experience of the stratification that happens for all genders inside of an industrial modern society.
It's a great question. Scotland, interestingly, is one of the quickest, earliest urbanising countries in Europe.
Okay,
right?
interesting,
right. From the
Yeah.
18th century, comparatively, it's always one of the more urbanised places. I would say that some of the places in, say, the 1820s, 30s, the late 18th century, where I see the loving community at its most potent is actually in places where they all live in tenements and everybody lives on top of each other, because a lot about what neighbourly love involves is actually about maintaining, it's about seeing everything, because they do, and about when you speak of it. And so privacy is maintained, I guess, by a fiction of what you speak of, right? And within working class communities. And so you only speak of certain kinds of things, you only breach privacy when certain kinds of conditions are met around seriousness or the need to breach it. And I think that's why we've seen the privacy stuff still coming up in these cases, right? Like that they come from a world where they're like, no, but you don't display people's dirty underwear because we can't afford to do that when we all live on top of each other in these kinds of ways. And I think even in the rural sense it still works, because these are still very small communities, still very small houses, and so there's a sense of knowing this. And I think what eventually does happen over time is that as people become more aspirational, their privacy does become more real. They don't live in the same house as each other anymore. The boundaries become harder, and the sense of aspiration of maintaining respectability heightens. And I think that happens relatively late in Scotland in the sort of 1920s and 30s.
So,
Thank you very much. Okay. The first thought that came to my mind, which was a little flippant, is that who knew Scottish men could be so sensitive? But then I'm thinking, are they really, or is it because Scottish law provides an opportunity for these people to find redress in court? And you spoke at the beginning of your talk about how redress changes over the course of time. But at the end of the day, is it not my feelings are hurt, my feelings are hurt, give me money so that they're not hurt so much anymore? Is that sort of the end sum of the redress? And then coming back, to what you were saying about hard, men and being hard. So you're intimating that there is a kind of shift over from the early modern period where men are much more emotional to the modern era where men become hard, masculine, physical strength and all the rest of it. But is that transformation not taking place also in other parts of Europe at the same time? Because I have this sense that men in the 19th century in Europe are much more open to crying than they are in the 20th century, for example. So that shift is taking place across Europe, perhaps at different paces, but more or less at the same time. So I'm sure you are too, but I'm trying to understand how does that transformation take place? How does that supposed hardness come about? And are they then, a jumble of questions, are they then so hard that they get upset when someone insults them, upset enough to take them to court? So there seems like a bit of a contradiction there.
Yeah. And also because basically if you get in a fight and the insults all occur in a violent, angry context, it's basically from 1899, it's no longer technically a legal issue, right? So it does expect certain kinds, it allows a certain kind of hard masculinity to exist outside of this, certainly the civil court system. We perhaps exist within the criminal court system if it was an assault, but it's a slightly different issue. I think, the first question was about compensation. So compensation is cash, but much more importantly than the cash, it's generally agreed as actually the court's decision what they say, right? And so it's about restoring reputation. And so judges always make an effort to try and say nice things. So they say, it'd be completely ridiculous to imagine this good and upstanding and honest gentleman was anything other than good and honest. And even in the case where the compassionate sympathy steal case, he goes, look, hard businessmen are meant to be like this, You're just being a good businessman. You should be okay, be happy, you're a good business. So there's kind of a sense in which that the judges understand that they have to make a statement that restores character, and that's part of the judgment. The costs of defamation, you win very little money. Really, it's very small amounts. A good compensation even today is like £5,000, right? For that reason, the number of defamation suits that happen now are tiny, and the reason we release them new papers is because they're the only people you're ever getting money out of anyway, right? And so in practice, the costs of litigation now far outstrip any financial benefit you'd ever get from doing it. And so that kind of changes, I guess, the game around litigation, but also kind of suggests that actually I think what people are really looking for isn't the money, it is a statement of character of form. Yes, I do think Scots are just Europeans. I'm not a big nationalist in that respect, in other respects, but not in the one that says that Scotland's are particularly distinct. My book on the kiss, which is out in August, is actually all about the decline and rise of kissing, right, amongst men. And so we do see this in Europe, that by the end of the 19th century, men no longer kiss each other on the lips, but actually anywhere, right? And it happens at slightly different rates. The the Dutch do it first. They get rid of it in the early modern period. The British get rid of kissing in the 18th century. This is men. In the 19th century and rest of Europe. So the mainland Europeans are a bit slow to drop out the kissing, but it does happen all over the place. The start of the 20th century is really dry. And then we get the 60s, everybody starts kissing again.
It's the room, but we have okay.
Okay. But the point here is actually, yeah, you're absolutely seeing this kind of 19th century trend of certain kinds of emotional gestures, particularly between men, are being constrained and restrained. One of the traditional answers to that is homosexuality, the rise of the homosexual becomes haunts all male intimacies. I'm never entirely convinced by that as an argument, to be honest, but I'm certainly probably has some part in the story. I think the reasons for the decline of the kiss are there's lots about germs and disease and a whole lot of there's a whole lot of discourse around certain kinds of touch and intimacies that play into this. And I think it's only one tiny part of a larger story about, what's going on with men. So let's just say I have more research to do.
We had one question from Bronwyn. Did you want to read that, Bronwyn, or do you want me to read it for you from the chat? I'll go ahead and read it from the chat. Yes. So Bronwyn wants to ask if these cases were won by the pursuer, are there any patterns there of which cases were more successful?
Oh, I haven't done that systematically. I would say more people win than lose. The other side of it is a lot of the judgments I'm using are appeal cases, so you might win in the first round, but you're actually maybe not going to win in the long run, and that's why it comes into appeal, and why we actually have a lot of good evidence for it is because it's in the higher courts. But yeah, so I guess the other side of that, Bronwyn, is because I haven't done the archives, I don't have every case, so I guess the answer is I don't know, but the ones I'm seeing, they're at least winning in the first round. I guess it's the short answer. Yeah.
All right. Well, we are at time, so let's thank Katie one more time for a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone on Zoom and in the room. And just a reminder that next week we will meet again with our very own Dr. Nicole Kimball, who will be speaking about From Chronicle to Canon, Classical Style and Insular Tradition, and Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Merlini. So that will be fantastic. And then we'll have our mid-semester break. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you again next week.